Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored, humbled, delighted to have the opportunity to engage you in this way. It seems to me that if ever there were a moment in which we needed to press the pause button and think about the legacy of Dr. King, that moment is now. At the same time, I worry a little bit about the ways in which our collective memory of King sometimes obscures the radicalizing dimension of his civil rights identity. And it's with King's radicalizing identity in mind that I think that when we think about civil rights, we have to have in mind more than the elimination of discrimination. We have to be thinking more concretely about achieving social transformation. So to develop that idea more completely, I want to title my brief comments the 3 R's of civil rights: reconciliation, reparations, and redistribution. My starting point is Dr. King himself. And when we think about Dr. King, it seems to me that we have to remember the man was not a static figure. His ideas evolved over time. His vision of social justice changed. You saw some of that in the opening clip, to be sure. But I want to focus on the man who wrote the I Have a Dream speech. The speech is undeniably one of the most important rhetorical moments in American civil rights history. But the common way in which we think about that speech is to describe it as a moment of reconciliation. It's a speech about children interracially holding hands. It's a speech about reaching the mountaintop and seeing the promised land. It's a speech about people across difference sitting at the table of brotherhood. It's a speech about being judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. It's a speech about the promise of American democracy, about the extent to which we might all be equal. And it's a speech about letting freedom ring from every domain of American society. These dimensions of King's speech sometimes invites what I want to call racial kumbayaism. So what do I mean by racial kumbayaism? I mean, it's a moment in which we're to respect each other's differences. Fair enough. A moment in which we should stop discriminating against. Fair enough. A moment in which we should be breaking bread with each other. A moment in which we should get along. None of us are going to argue against these ideas. Presumably, all of us think that we should get along. All of us think that we should stop discriminating against. All of us think that we should break bread. That's the easy part. What I want to say is that our thinking about racial reconciliation simply has racial kumbayaism in mind. We will not be able to do the hard work of fundamentally transforming society. So this is what I want us to think about. What did King have in mind when he thought about social transformation? Well, let's hear from King himself, because it is a dimension of the I Have a Dream speech that we always hear little about. King's words: 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today. And I always have to apologize for reading King because I sound nothing like him, so indulge it. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree was a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negroes who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty amidst the vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro still languishes in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his home land. In a sense, King continues, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the great architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words in the Constitution and the Emancipation and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note. It's obvious today that America has defaulted on that promissory note, insofar as the citizens of colors are concerned. Instead of honoring its sacred obligation, America has given the Negro a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and security. So when we read King as simply calling for racial harmony, racial healing, we underread King. To put it another way, King was in a sense asking American society to show us the money. King was asking for social transformation. I don't mean that literally in the sense of dollars and cents. What I mean to say is that he was asking for investment into the material well-being of Black people's lives. To put all of this another way, King's Eye of a Dream speech was a call for reparations, was a call for redistribution, and we need to remember that going forward. So what I want to do in the time that I have left is say something more about this idea of reparations and redistribution. And in the context of doing so, I want to continue to riff on King's idea of a check. But I want to change up the metaphor just a little bit to suggest that the problem for us as Black people in this country is not just that the check has come back marked insufficient funds. It's not just that our civil rights check has repeatedly bounced, though that's a part of the problem. It's also that the civil rights checks that have cleared have not been enough to cover the cost of discrimination and the cost of inequality in Black people's lives. So I want to develop this claim just a little bit more. But to do that, you're going to have to indulge me because I need to take you back to elementary school. We need to do a little bit of math. Now, it's simple math, I promise you, where the answer is either A, 0, or B, racial inequality. Now, you should already know what the answer is. But here is the contour of the math. What we want to do is simply add up racial inequality in a particular historical moment. That's our move one. And we want to say, well, what civil rights check did we get to eliminate that racial inequality, and was it enough? When you apply the civil rights check that we were given to deal with the racial inequality, do you get A, 0, no racial inequality, or do you have racial inequality left over? Answer B. What do you think the answer is going to be going forward? A or B? All right, so you're good to go. So let me unpack that with a little bit more historical specificity. Let's think about slavery. We do not talk enough about slavery as a foundational dimension of American democracy. Slavery was not oppositional to American democracy. Slavery was not inconsistent with American democracy. Slavery was a form of American democracy, and we need to always remember that that's the case. In the context of slavery, we had no rights. We had no property. We were property. In the context of slavery, our humanity was denied. In the context of slavery, we were constructed as inferior. None of this ought to be contestable today, it seems to me. Let's think about what civil rights check we got in the context of slavery. We got Reconstruction. That was the civil rights check. What did Reconstruction look like? Well, it included significant amendments to the Constitution. You know these amendments. The 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, it said that Black people are now citizens of the United States. The 15th Amendment, it said that you can no longer discriminate against Black people with respect to voting. So slavery produced racial inequality, one. We cashed the Reconstruction check. Do we get no racial inequality left over? Or are we still racially subordinated in that context? B is the answer. So we cleared the check. It's not as though that check bounced. It was just never enough to deal with the inequality that slavery produced. But wait, there's more. Let's go on to Jim Crow. So when we start our analysis with Jim Crow, we have to carry forward the racial inequality of slavery. We can't let that go. We bring that forward, the racial inequality that was left over after we cashed our check. And then we add to that the legal segregation. We add to that the inferior schooling, the inferior housing. We add to that the denial of our opportunities to vote, notwithstanding the 15th Amendment. And we add it all up, and we get racial inequality too. But again, there's a civil rights check. What's our civil rights check? Brown v. Board of Education. You all know something about Brown v. Board of Education. So Brown v. Board of Education overruled a constitutional case that said separate but equal was constitutional. What case am I talking about? Plessy versus Ferguson. So in Plessy versus Ferguson, the basic argument was, you cannot racially segregate us. We have the 14th Amendment. That was our civil rights check. The 14th Amendment said that we are entitled to equal protection of the laws, and separate but equal violates that. The Supreme Court said no. Why? Because segregation treats black people and white people exactly the same. You should look at me puzzled. How does the Supreme Court sustain that analysis? Well, racial segregation separates black people from white people, and racial segregation separates white people from black people. It's treated them the same. This is supposed to be the highest intellects on the Supreme Court articulating that argument. And by the way, if you feel inferior, black people, that's your problem. It's not that the laws stigmatizes you, it's that you have an inferior sense of self. That is the Supreme Court. And we can go back to slavery and think about the way the Supreme Court constitutionalized slavery by way of the idea that the white man, the black man rather, has no rights that the white man was bound to respect. But to continue with the racial math that I'm asking you to consider, you have racial inequality that's produced, again, by racial segregation. You have Brown v. Board of Education. You do the math. Does Brown eliminate the racial inequality of racial segregation? The answer, again, is B. One more time. So now we're post-Brown. We're post-Brown v. Board of Education. What kind of racial inequality do we see? Private discrimination, state discrimination, legalized violence in the form of lynchings. Still, we're being denied the right to vote. Once again, there's a civil rights check. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We clear these checks. They do not come back bounced. There is still a racial remainder. We have still not intervened in a way that fundamentally addresses the ubiquitous forms of racial inequality on the ground. Now, I could go on and on and on with this math, but I think you get the basic idea. And if we're to think about what happens in the 1970s, in the 1980s, in the 1990s to the present, these are moments in which we stop getting civil rights checks. So A, we get checks initially that bounced, marked insufficient funds. Then we get checks that are insufficient to the task of eradicating racial inequality, and then we stop getting checks. What do we get? We get a framing of civil rights as special rights, and I'll say something more about that in a minute. We get affirmative action that is still heavily scrutinized. Indeed, in the state of California, we can't even practice affirmative action. It's illegal. What do we get? We get a conception of discrimination that says the only form of discrimination that we're worried about, constitutionally speaking, is intentional discrimination. Is if a white person says, I am going to discriminate against you because you're black, Devon Carbado. Is that the only way that racism operates? And if a white person said that to me, you wouldn't simply call that person a racist person. You would call that a stupid person for announcing their racism. Racism isn't going to announce itself in that way, by and large, although in the Trump era it oftentimes does. Racism operates more structurally. So when the constitutional law structures itself around eliminating only intentional forms of discrimination, it's going to leave the criminal justice project in place. It's not going to deal with all the forms of disparities that we know exist in society today. It's not going to deal with de facto segregation. It's not going to deal with the fact that our schools are still separate and equal. It's not going to deal with our underemployment. It's not going to deal with the extent to which we continue to suffer premature death. None of that is reachable if the discrimination question that you're asking is whether some individual white person intentionally discriminated against some individual black person. Clearly, we have to do better than that. So let me see two additional points before I shut up. The first is that social change in this country has never come about because a majority of Americans has said, let's hold hands in interracial harmony, and to quote Spike Lee, do the right thing. That's not how change has happened. The end of slavery required a civil war. Brown versus Board of Education required a Supreme Court to rule against a majority of racist thinkers in the South and racist thinkers in the North. The Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s occurred against the backdrop of massive social upheaval and massive resistance. And King himself was not celebrated in his time as a civil rights hero. Indeed, by the time that King gave that interview that you saw earlier on, he had a 75% disapproval rating. So we kind of hold him out today as this hero, in light of the fact that in his time, he was not so perceived. What I'm trying to say is that there's never been a moment when this nation has been ready for the kind of civil rights claim that black people have demanded. This is precisely what King was referring to when he suggested that there is ambivalence, when he suggested that there is vacillation, when he suggested that there is backlash, when he suggested that we get things on the installment plan at best. This is what he is speaking to. In fact, as I suggested earlier, our civil rights claims are typically framed as special rights claims, that we're asking for preferences. And to give you an example, a really salient example of this idea that our pursuit of civil rights are understood as special rights or racial preferences, I want to take you back in time to Reconstruction. In the context of Reconstruction, Congress had passed a Civil Rights Act, and that Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination on the part of private people. So people who were running, for example, motels or theaters were discriminated against African Americans. Congress passed legislation saying you can't do that. That legislation was challenged in the Supreme Court. The question was whether Congress could pass such legislation. The Supreme Court said no. Congress exceeded its authority when it passed that legislation. And in the context of so ruling, the court had this to say, quote, there must be some stage, when a man has emerged from slavery by the aid of beneficent legislation, there must be some stage in the progress of his elevation when he takes the rank of mere men and no longer is the special favorite of the laws. So in the 1860s, when black people are just up from slavery, civil rights legislation to stop discrimination against us is framed as a preference. It's framed as us being subject to being the special favorites of the laws. All of this is to say, I think, that when we engage the question of King and his legacy, we have to bring back some radicalism into the conversation. We have to move beyond the idea that what King was asking for was simply kumbayaism. This is not to poo-poo kumbayaism. We want that. King wanted racial harmony. He wanted racial healing. He believed in American democracy, perhaps too much. He was optimistic, we know that. But he also believed in the fierce urgency of now. He also believed that we cannot wait, that the imperative that we wait rings in the ears of every black person with piercing familiarity. King also insisted on contesting racial power. He also insisted on realism. He also insisted on effectuating social transformation. In this respect, the point is not that we should forget King's dream. It's rather that we should properly remember it as including a radical vision of social transformation towards what King called genuine equality. It's only when we think of King in these terms, it seems to me, that we might, just might, avoid the nightmare about which he was so profoundly concerned at the end of his life. Thank you.